Chapter 14 Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Songs referenced in this chapter can be found on Spotify and other places you hear music under the band name Cone of Magic and their album Maidens Rock. Now, Chapter 14 Alice and her new band, The Ladies. By the time she returned to the comfort of the house, Alice felt like she had really gone down the rabbit hole. People snatched from their homes, given meaningless tasks, and then exiled when they did not fulfill them. And what about the exile? Sure, it was a vast home, a castle really, but even with all the comforts one could ask of this time, it was still in this time, which could be years or even centuries away from what some people called home. Even if a person happened to be born in this century, Dartmoor Castle was isolated in the middle of nowhere. Alice loved reading mysteries and considered herself a pretty good amateur sleuth, but she knew she was missing a key piece to this particular puzzle. "It just doesn't make any sense," she said to an ornately carved doorknob, which seemed to her to wear a friendly, listening expression. Alice wanted to be reasonable, but a part of her couldn't help but think of this as some kind of weird experiment. She recognized there were still a number of unknown variables in the equation, but why had Brian been pulled back through time? It just wasn't a sisterly tendency to discount her brother's importance on general principle. She was first to admit Brian could fit in someplace useful, but not when he was suffering from the unfortunate side effects of insulin rationing. Brian's diabetes had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember, and so was the two-pronged art of adjusting her life to fit his illness and explaining it to almost everyone she ever met. Before he got his pump, Brian and the rest of the family had pretty much gotten into the routine of eating every 5 hours or so if it was a family meal, and all of them could tell just by looking at his face when his blood sugar was dropping. Her friends had even stopped thinking it weird when she would look at her older brother and say, "Brian, go eat something. You're looking goofy." And then Brian would obediently go to the kitchen and eat 4 pieces of bite-sized candy or drink the can of regular soda that would constitute the at-home antidote to low blood sugar. In fact, Alice had really had to impress upon her friends the difference between snacky candy and medicinal candy. On one particularly memorable sleepover, her friends had raided Brian's candy bowl in the middle of the night. As luck would have it, Brian had suffered a major drop in his blood sugar, and they were caught red-handed. While her brother had raged through the house, staggering and incoherent, her dad had covered his fear by screaming at her for being so irresponsible with her brother's life. Mom had ground up a jillion oranges and a pound of sugar to make a super sweet syrup to shovel down Brian's gullet while her friends watched the family drama wide-eyed from the sanctuary of their sleeping bags. It had certainly driven the point home. Ever since, Alice had been invited to sleepovers, but was never allowed to host. Word got around school quickly enough. In Alice's house, candy was medicine. Do not ever or even think about touching candy ever. She did know that Brian loved his new pump. With it, the rigid timing of his meals could relax, and the amount of food he could eat become much more variable. He seemed to enjoy not being the one whose health determined the time and quality of everyone else's meals. On the other hand, before the pump, Brian had always carried a bottle of insulin with him, as well at least a couple of syringes. While his control might be better now, the fact he only had to give himself his shot every 3 days rather than twice a day meant that he no longer carried his diabetes supplied in his pocket. "It's too bad," Alice murmured to her reflection in a nearby mirror. "A few of those supplies might have come in handy if he ever happened to be, say, kidnapped to a time and place without insulin or syringes. I wonder if that contingency was covered in the pharmacist's notes. I know I couldn't make it past the first 2 pages of them." Had her brother been brought here only to die without modern medicine? Or a valid written warning? "No," she murmured, "he has to be here for a purpose." She recognized the trope of time travel, being a fan of both romances and science fiction, in both books and movies. Brian's presence here couldn't be due to random chance. He must have been picked for some reason. The proposal was possibly key. At least it was a clue they could reasonably follow. But Alice couldn't wonder if she were meant to have some role here as well. Was it a mistake to be spending all her time trying to figure it out? "No one else seems to be making any effort to do it," she said, and while she knew it was just her imagination, Alice couldn't help but think the sound of the door closing behind her signified agreement. She didn't know what times the other travelers had belonged to, but her gut feeling was that Brian was from the most modern era. She didn't consider herself as part of the equation. She'd almost always felt outside the main picture, and that sense continued here. All the other time travelers had arrived solo, as far as she could discover, and she was just the exception, drawn as usual into her brother's orbit to help take care of him. The difference this time, she told the carved post at the bottom of the staircase, is that there's not just one loose end, me, but 3 more. 3 women who seem to have done nothing wrong. Now they're in the castle, just moments away from being subjected to an amateur theatrical or something equally awful. I wonder how the apologies are going. "What do you want with these ladies, Carl?" she asked. The house provided a medley of its usual old house noises, but a scattering of handwritten exposition failed significantly to rain down upon her from the mysterious attic, nor did a doorway magically open, revealing a vitally important clue to a backstory that would provide a direction to the narrative, or at least give a sense of pathos to the scene. She sighed in disappointment. "Unless," she said. Alice actually looked up to check that no one was watching and pinched herself. She was willing to risk the embarrassment of "it was only a dream" just to get her brother home with his insulin. But honestly, if it proved to be in the end to be nothing but a dream, she was going to be very, very annoyed. "If I open one of these doors and find a dying rose under glass, illuminated by a single sunbeam, or if it turns out there's a compulsion for us all to sing, that's going to be even more annoying." And, she thought, if the explanation for all this included the words matrix or the phrase, the culmination of the cosmic clash between the forces of good and evil, or involved a 20-page discussion of the physics of wormholes through the fabric of space and time, someone, somewhere, was gonna get an earful. While thinking, Alice had been wandering from one room to another, each marked by a slightly different arrangement of furniture and a ridiculous number of open windows, which she would close each and every time. It was cold outside. The view on one side of the house was of the garden and the moors, and on the other side, the ocean. But all at once, she found herself someplace completely different. It was the music room. The number of instruments gave it away. In this room, the curtains were not billowing as the windows were closed, but the floorboards creaked agreeably as she entered. Alice gravitated towards the piano. She sat down. Her eyes widened. She had heard of a Broadwood, of course, but never touched one before. And this was no museum piece, but new. Tentatively, she struck a key and frowned. It was quiet. She struck the key again, harder, but still, it was a much more dainty sound than her modern ears were used to. "Damn harpsichord," she muttered, and spread her fingers over the well-kept keys and played a chord. She played that chord again, and then another, sensing both the similarities and differences between the instrument she was used to and the instrument she now had. After a bit, she realized this would never be her piano at home, and she overcame her feeling of wrongness. She began to play with the softer sound of this piano, albeit with a forcefulness that might have sounded wrong to a contemporary ear. Fortunately, there weren't any of those in the room at the moment. At home, Alice had a band, Cone of Magic, and while its origins dated from the sleepover era with her friends, they had long ago left the set list of cover tunes and started to play their own music. Their album, Maiden's Rock, was on Amazon and had sold all of 4 copies to non-band members that they didn't know. They would play any sort of gig, including the ill-fated wedding that had kicked off this unfortunate adventure. The band liked to think they had a pop country kind of vibe, but on the Broadwood, their power pop ballad, Pick on the Boys, somehow became something gentler. Someone had fortunately left some blank sheet music and a pencil at the piano, and Alice began to scribble down a melodic line and some chord shapes, wrestling with her creative muse in an attempt to rework the tune with her new instrument. It was unnecessary, but it felt productive, and Alice was happily noodling on the keyboard, letting the time travel mystery simmer on the back burner of her consciousness for a few minutes when she was interrupted. Alice looked up. Lady Iris Patten was close, peering over shoulder, looking at the music. No, not just looking, Alice realized. Iris was reading the chicken-scratched notes as if she understood them. "Did you write this?" Iris continued. Her tone managed to express both disbelief that Alice, from the colonies, who had done little to distinguish herself to her guests, was capable of such mastery, and an assumption that music was totally a correct and appropriate thing for a lady of the house to do in her free time. "Yes, but it's not really meant for this kind of instrument," Alice began to apologize. thinking of the drums and bass and electric guitars blasting the way the song was meant to be played, Lady Iris ignored her and took a graceful seat at the harp to one side of the room. She touched a few strings, clearly testing to see if they were in tune, and then she nodded. "Start again," she said. Stunned into silence, Alice complied. She began the piece again, but this time Iris joined in on the harp, which went surprisingly well with the softer piano. Iris, Alice realized, had somehow noted what Alice, the composer and performer, was going for and had the skill to emphasize those elements when she played. Alice, for her part, had experience with ensemble playing. It felt quite natural to cede the harp and Iris, its player, a place in the performance. The two of them played together for a few moments, creating something new from the quick sketch Alice had made of her old song and something Iris included that seemed like a familiar ballad. It worked, and they might have continued even longer, but they, in turn, were interrupted by the two others. "You play divinely," said Eliza. "I don't think I've heard that piece before," added Lenora, sneaking a look at the music that must have been difficult to read, being at this point not so much more than the scribbles Alice had made as mnemonic devices while the song developed. Alice blushed, but Iris seemed to find it completely normal that Eliza and Lenora had been listening so intently. "Our hostess wrote it," she said, and made a graceful gesture. "Please, ladies, join us." Alice realized that, as hostess, she should have uttered the invitation, but Iris had done it so naturally that it was impossible to be miffed at her about it, especially because neither of the other two ladies even hesitated. They stepped forward at once. Lenora found a violin and began to tune it while examining the music over Alice's shoulder. Eliza picked up a flute and ran through a few runs, warming up before she, too, leaned over and looked at the music. No one seemed surprised that there were musical instruments just lying out, or had any compunction about guests just picking them up and playing them. "There's more to it," began Alice nervously, "and I'm not sure." Iris gave Alice a brief, hard look, so full of meaning it was impossible to ignore. Alice could recognize a hint if it was dropped on her hard enough. She belatedly recognized that she was being given a chance to play the role she had earned as both the composer of the piece and hostess of the house. She drew a deep breath. "Ladies, please," in the key of G. They began to play. The women were really good, taking her hastily scattered notes and creating something listenable. Alice was amazed at first, but then almost laughed at herself. She should have expected it. This was a time when any home entertainment had to be generated by people actually in the home, and these ladies had been valued as parts of their own home entertainment systems. Eliza made the flute soar, while Iris gave the harp a wistful hardness, a sound like nothing Alice had heard before. Lenora, on violin, seemed to delight in simply enriching the sound while keeping the beat for all. Alice had never heard her music sound anything like this before. The ladies seemed too focused on following the idiosyncratic chord progressions of her music too much to be alarmed by the forcefulness with which she struck the Broadway's keys. They, in turn, were impressed. This was a skill that they recognized and valued. Eliza was first to speak as she carefully lowered her flute. "This sounds like a song," she offered tentatively. "Are there lyrics?" "Oh, yes," said Alice, "but—" "Well, won't you share them with us?" asked Lenora, as if this were the next reasonable question. "I'm worried you won't, care for them," Alice began. "Why wouldn't we?" Lady Iris asked. "What are they?" "Well, like my brother and I, the lyrics come from the future," Alice said. The other three ladies stiffened, and their smiles became a little strained. It had been one thing for manic Lord Latimer to say it, but to hear it so matter-of-factly from someone clearly not raving mad, someone who they were actually getting to like, struck them in a different way. And, as in the case of so many other socially awkward pauses, this one was overcome by a collective, willful avoidance of the topic. The lyrics. Lenora plowed ahead. Alice recognized the reprieve she had been granted and continued, "So long as you understand that in my time I'm part of an all-girl band, and the name of the song is Pick on the Boys." She drew a breath, thinking, "In for a penny, in for a pound," and she began to sing the refrain. "Make boys the ones who have to conform backwards from death till the day they're born. Let boys know the ever-present fear of not being pretty, being slutty, or too queer." She stopped. The ladies were looking at her, stunned. Possibly they didn't understand the words, she thought. But no, even if some of them had shifted definition a little over the centuries, surely the integral thought was, It's Mary Wollstonecraft-like," said Eliza, deftly said Alice, deftly derailing Alice's train of thought. "And you sang that song in public?" said Lenora. "Has your brother heard this song?" asked Iris with such a careful bit of nonchalance that Alice realized the lady was not entirely as casual as she wanted to seem. Maybe she thought she was discovering another aspect to Brian's madness. Maybe it was something else. "To be completely honest, he wrote some of it," said Alice, "and I wrote the other parts. And I wrote the music." "In the colonies?" Eliza asked incredulously. Alice couldn't help but laugh. "A couple centuries from now, sure, but yes, in the colonies." She continued to pick out the melody on the Broadwood, pressing the keys one by one, while the other ladies digested this. Alice wondered what was the larger surprise, that a woman could be part of a public performance, or that her brother supported this behavior. By now, surely, the bit about the future was old hat. "Your brother wrote that?" Iris said, clearly processing something she wanted completely clear. "Lord Latimer does seem adept at finding words for songs," Eliza said, as one honor-bound to find something complimentary to say. "At least there are no rabbits in this one," she concluded, somewhat obscurely. The same Lord Latimer who wrote that also owns all of this? Lenora asked, gesturing broadly to include the castle and the lands that surrounded it, clearly thinking of another aspect of Brian's character that she wanted to be absolutely sure of. We are referring to the one with the coat and the estate? The same. It's my song, basically, but he did come up with the conform-born lines, Alice clarified. But he has really supported the band from the get-go. He got us on Amazon and Spotify, and he runs the board on all our shows, she concluded, as if honor-bound to give them all the details. The ladies digested this, though she could tell most of the words she'd used made no sense to them. Maybe they thought she was as crazy as her brother. The room went quiet. Iris spoke first, setting aside any further talk of madness or the future, as if, just now, the music was the only thing that mattered. Let us hear that extraordinary refrain again, she said. Alice sang. Though Lady Iris had heard the chorus only once, she was familiar with the melody and began to harmonize with her, and their voices blended well together. Eliza joined in, surprising everyone with a rich, deep alto. Lenora joined in last of all, her voice a pleasant contra which rounded out the song nicely. United by music, the group sang and played through the rest of the afternoon. They ran through at least half of the catalog of Alice's band's music, but the ladies also taught Alice their own favorite ballads of the day. In the music room, with the old castle creaking and new friendships blossoming, Alice was able, for the moment, to let go of her anxiety about her brother, and there was nothing to do at the moment but sing and play and make friends. End of chapter 14. Alice's 21st century band, Cone of Magic, and their album Maiden's Rock can be heard on such places as Amazon, Spotify, and any place you can find good music. Lord Latimer's Ladies has been written by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, and read by Dan McLaughlin.